Welcome to session 1 of our virtual Serve Your City group. Today we're going to be taking a look at connecting with God's heart. This is kind of like Serving 101. This is a great foundation for everything else that we're going to talk about. Just a reminder, you can pause the video at any time if you need to take a little bit of extra time to think or pray or reflect on something that we're talking about. It also might be helpful for you to have a pen and paper or something that you can use to take notes, your phone, your computer, whatever is helpful for you, and also a Bible. I'll do my best to put the verses on the screen when I can, but it may be helpful for you to read along or just make a note that you can check back and really dig into some of the Bible stories that we're going to be using today for examples. There's a few places that I will mention that we'll stop and discuss something in our Facebook group. So you can either pause the video and take a few notes at those areas and continue with the video, or you can pause the video and jump right into Facebook and jump into our group and post your thoughts and comments at that time. Whatever works best for you. Now, one more thing about the Facebook group as we're getting started. I hope that you'll use this group as a discussion among friends in this group. What I don't want to happen is it ends up being like the message boards for online college classes where you post your answer and never come back and look again. I hope that you'll read everybody else's thoughts, you'll interact with them, and that we can really create a good dialogue through these first couple weeks as we explore how God created us as well. So let's get started. The first thing I want you to do today is think of 5 people who made you feel cared for. And I want you to pause the video and write their names down. I'll give you a few seconds to do that. What I want you to notice about the names on your list is that I would guess that they are probably just everyday people. I would imagine that they didn't cure any diseases or show up on the cover of Time magazine as the person of the year. But God still used them to work in your life, and His love was reflected through them. And I wanted you to start this way because I want you to remember that just like God used them, God can use you and me too. As normal as we are, He can use us to make a huge difference in the lives of others. If we were meeting in person, I would have you turn to page 5 of your book. You would get a book that looks something like this that we would go through together. But since we're doing this virtually, I'm doing some cutting and pasting and trying to weave this all together. But I'm going to read you the introduction because it's such a good basis for what we're going to talk about today. Here's what it says. The ability to truly love and serve others comes out of the overflow of our abiding relationship with Jesus Christ. When loving and serving others is the overflow of Christ's life in us, then our serve comes out of abundance. We must first understand that as believers, Christ is living in us. We are not serving and loving people for Jesus, but rather with Him. So let's focus for a moment on that last sentence. We are not serving and loving people for Jesus, but rather with Him. What does that mean to you? I want you to think about that for a moment, and we will discuss this in our Facebook group. So take a few minutes, maybe pause the video here, and think about what it means when we serve and love people for Jesus versus with Him. And I look forward to seeing your thoughts on Facebook. You know, God gives us some great instruction in the Bible when it comes to loving others. And we're going to check out 2 passages here. I'll put them up on the screen, but you can read along in your own Bible if you'd like. I'm using the NIV translation if you're following along. The first is Matthew 22, 36 through 40. You probably know it as the Great Commandment. Here's what it says. Teacher, which is the greatest commandment in the law? Jesus replied, love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment. And the second is like it. Love your neighbor as yourself. All the law and the prophets hang on these 2 commandments. Now, if you're like me, you really like checklists. I'm a big list maker, and I like to write things on my list and then check them off and move on to the next thing. And when I was a young Christian, I often thought of this verse as a checklist. You love God, check, and then you love people, check, and then you move on. And then I read a book by a guy named Bob Goff, and Bob writes really great books that make loving others seem really, really simple. And I have them linked on our group resources on Cornerstone's website. So if you want to check those out, please feel free. But in one of his books, he talks about this verse being less like a checklist and more like a cycle. When we're loving God with everything we have, with our heart and our soul and our mind, his love is going to pour out of us into other people. Just like that introduction for the Serve Your City group said, that we can serve out of the abundance of God in us. But when we're loving people out of that abundance, it's going to point us right back to God. So it's a constant cycle that happens. When we love God, we are able to better love people. And when we love people out of that abundance, it points us right back to God. And we just continue and continue and continue. The second passage that we're going to read also comes from the book of Matthew. It's Matthew 25, 35 through 40. I often refer to this as the least of these passages. Here's what it says. For I was hungry, and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you invited me in. I needed clothes, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you looked after me. I was in prison, and you came to visit me. Then the righteous will answer him, Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you something to drink? When did we see you a stranger and invite you in, or needing clothes and clothed you? When did we see you sick or in prison and go to visit you? The king will reply, Truly I tell you, whatever you did for one of the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did for me. Dino Rizzo, who is the author of the book Serve Your City and also these resources that we're using today, said this, From the earliest pages of the Bible, God instructed his people to care for widows, orphans, the poor, and the immigrants. Today, we would add single moms, addicts, the elderly, the homeless, women who have been trafficked, and other vulnerable groups. You can probably add your own groups here too. I think right now we can all add people who have been impacted in one way or another because of COVID-19. But these are the least of these. We still have them. Even though it's not the same time period as the Bible anymore, we still have people who need Jesus. But when we're loving others, we're loving Jesus too. That's what this verse tells us. When we love the least of these, we are loving Jesus right along with them. So I want you to make a couple notes here, and these notes will be personal. We won't share them on Facebook, but I want you to reflect on yourself so you have a good starting point as we move forward. And I want you to think about, how are you currently living out these two verses, the least of these and the great commandment? What do they look like in your life? How are you loving God? What's your relationship with him like? What groups might you add to the least of these? What groups do you see in your own life that you would count as the least of these, like Jesus tells us in Matthew here? And how are you loving them? How are you caring for them? How are you showing them grace and love? So pause the video here for a moment and just make some notes about how these two verses are reflected in your life. So now we're going to move into really the backbone of not only connecting with God's heart, but really the great foundation for learning about serving and discovering how God created us to serve. These are really great building blocks for us to build on as we move forward. And in this section, I'm going to be referring quite a bit to a story that I love from the Bible. It's found in Luke chapter 5, verses 17 through 39. I'm going to summarize the story for you, but if it's unfamiliar, I encourage you to take some time and read through it as well. So this story picks up with Jesus teaching in a home, and there's people who largely are religious leaders had come from all over to hear him teach. And when I think about this scene, I imagine Jesus being in this room and the house was packed. There were people leaning in the windows, crowding around the door, just all surrounding this house trying to get a glimpse of Jesus. In this story, there's also a group of guys, and these guys have a friend who is paralyzed. They knew Jesus was in town, and they knew that if they could just get their friend to Jesus, he would be healed, and his life would be totally different. So they carry their paralyzed friend on his bed through town, but they couldn't even get close to the house. There were so many people there. But that didn't stop them. They climbed up on the roof of the house, they ripped away some of the tiles on the roof, and they lowered their friend into the feet of Jesus. I like to imagine what everybody in that room might have been thinking. Did they think it was a prank happening? Were they angry? Some of them probably were that Jesus got interrupted. But the friends didn't care. All they cared about was getting their friend to Jesus because they knew he could make a huge difference in their friend's life. So, our first point in this foundation of connecting with the heart of God is this: serving others should point to God, not ourselves. If we look at the guys in this story, the ones who carried their friend, we don't really know anything about them. All we know is that they carried their friend. We don't know their names. They didn't go down in history for being friends of the century. We just know that they destroyed a roof and got their friends to Jesus. And that should be our motivation when we serve. We just need to get people to Jesus. It's not about us. It's not about making ourselves look better. It's not about how great our plan or our program is or how many resources we have. It's about the person that we're serving and the power of Jesus in their life. Like those guys in the story, we can best point people to Jesus when our focus is on God and through relationships with the person we're serving. That's our next point. Serving others should be a vehicle to form relationships so that they may come to know Jesus. So I want you to pause here for a moment and think about what this looks like and why it's important. And then I hope that you will share your thoughts on Facebook. I'm not going to give you a whole lot of content here because I'm really curious to see the conversation that takes place in our Facebook group. So take a few moments, write some notes, or hop into our Facebook group right now and just share your thoughts on why having a relationship with others is important for them to know Jesus. Our third point is serving others should be a sample of the gospel of Christ. Think about some things that Jesus did to show love and grace. There are tons of examples in the Bible. In fact, his whole ministry is full of them. But a lot of these stories center around how Jesus dealt with people and how he treated people. And one of my favorite stories in the Bible is the story of Zacchaeus. It's found in Luke 19. Maybe you know the song from Sunday school. Zacchaeus was a wee little man was he. The story goes something like this. When Jesus was traveling, he passed through a town named Jericho. And like most places that Jesus went, there was a huge crowd that gathered to see him. In Jericho, there was also a guy named Zacchaeus. Zacchaeus was the chief tax collector, and he was not very well liked. He was probably hated. As chief tax collector, he not only collected taxes, but he also collected a little bit for himself. He was a thief. He cheated people. If he had any real friends, well, he didn't have any real friends. If he had any semi-friends, it was probably just people that were trying to keep him close so he didn't steal as much from them. He was a pretty bad guy. We also know from the Bible that he was very short and he was very wealthy. So in this story in the Bible, when Jesus is traveling through Jericho, like everyone else in the town, Zacchaeus wanted to catch a glimpse of Jesus. But because of his size, he couldn't see over the crowd. So he climbed a tree, a sycamore tree, in fact. And when Jesus passed by, he stopped at the tree and looked up at Zacchaeus and said, "Zacchaeus, come down immediately, because I'm coming to your house." Now, the people of the town were appalled. They couldn't believe it. Zacchaeus was a thief. He was a sinner. He's like the lowest of the low. Why is Jesus hanging out with him? But this is exactly what Jesus did, because Jesus saw something deeper in Zacchaeus. He saw his need for love and for acceptance and grace and forgiveness. He saw Zacchaeus' need for a savior. And because of this encounter with Jesus, Zacchaeus was totally changed. He immediately gave half of his possessions to the poor. He not only paid back everything he stole, he paid back 4 times that amount. And the end of the story in the Bible says, the Son of Man came to seek and save the lost. There's kind of a similar story in the Bible with the woman at the well. I'll let you read that one on your own. It's in John 4. But Jesus had this uncanny way of seeing people in their mess and in their hurt and in their pain and their sin and going right into it and diving right in with nothing holding him back because he saw what they could be on the other side. He had this way of meeting people where they are, but he didn't leave them there. He met them at the tree or at the well, and then he changed their life forever. He didn't shy away from their mess and their baggage. Instead, he saw their heart and he knew what they needed to the core. He knew they needed love and grace. But he also hit their other needs too, so he had a chance to get there. This is a great example for us. It's a great example to go back through the points that we're learning so far, that everything points back to God because everyone needs him as a savior. But first, they need a relationship. We need to build trust. And it also means that sometimes we're committed for the long haul. Serving others isn't a checklist that you move on. It means you're willing to walk with people. And that's our next point. Serving others should go the extra mile to show God's love. In Matthew 5:41, it says, if anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go with them 2 miles. When you're willing to be like Jesus, to pour out his love for others, it means that we refuse to leave people in their sin, in their hurt, in their mess, in their fear, but we come alongside of them and put our arm around them and walk with them as far as they need to go. Maybe they need some food, but we don't just stop there. We take them to the next step. We walk with them to the next step so that they can see Jesus. Think of the men who lowered their friend through the roof. They not only went a few miles carrying their friend through the streets, they destroyed property. They did whatever it took to get their friend to the feet of Jesus. So I want you to take a moment here and reflect. And we're not going to share this on Facebook. This is just for your own reflection. Think of a time that someone went the extra mile for you and how you were able to experience God's love through them. Our last point for today flows very nicely into our next session. It's this: serving others will glorify God through his church. In the next session, we're going to spend some time looking at how God uniquely created each one of us and how we can use that to serve others. But God also tells us in the Bible that he uniquely created us to work together. Just like one body, with each body part having a different role, it all has to work together for us to function. And the church is the same way. We all have a role, we all have skills, we all have unique things that we're great at, but we can only go so far on our own. God created us in this specific way so that we can work together to best glorify him and bring people to meet him. In the book, Serve Your City, Dino Rizzo says this: we have an incredible number of opportunities to step into the lives of hurting people. When the worst happens, Christians are the best thing to happen to a town or a city. When someone is gravely sick or killed, those who have experienced the compassion of Jesus weep with those who weep. When natural disasters destroy a community, those whose hearts are filled with faith, hope, and love step in to provide a shoulder to cry on, some sweat and labor to fix things, and to fill a hungry stomach or two. When times are difficult and dark, Christians shine like lights in a troubled world. In a world with so much hate and division, we show and tell people about the healing love of Jesus. I don't know that I've ever seen a time, for as long as this has been, where this is being lived out than right now in the COVID-19 pandemic. There are people all over the world loving one another and helping one another. And there's still division and there's still hate, but God's light is shining through the community right now. And we want to keep that going. We want to carry that light. So in the next session, we're going to take a look at how God uniquely created you to serve and how that all works together on our team and in our church and in our community. But I want to end today with a few things. First, there's something I want you to consider, and this we'll share on Facebook. What are some ways that your life can point toward God? In that quote that I read, Dino Rizzo reminds us that people that have experienced the compassion of Jesus are then able to extend that to others. He also says this: graced people grace people, healed people heal people, forgiven people forgive people, loved people love people, accepted people accept people. Because of our experience, when we experience God's grace, we can use that to point others to God. So I want you to consider, as we wrap up today, what are things that you have experienced in your life? Grace, healing, forgiveness, and how can God use that to point other people to Him? If you need some help getting started with your answer, check out 2 Corinthians 1:4. But I want you to make some notes about that and then jump into the Facebook group and share your thoughts. And as one last thing today, I want to give you a challenge. I want to challenge you to go the extra mile for someone. It doesn't have to be huge. Don't overthink it. Just do it. Just go do something extra for someone and then go a little farther. Go the extra mile. I look forward to chatting with you all in our Facebook group. And when you're ready, you can jump into session 2.